ready. We're ready to begin. Is it? Okay. All right. Is that good? Oh, yeah. That's good. That's good. All right. I think we are ready to go. Well, good morning. Thank you all for being here today. I'm Stephanie Wade, Executive Director at the Historic Arkansas Museum, and we are very pleased to be a partner in this endeavor. As you all know, or you would not be here this morning, it is so important that we commemorate local and state history. And today we'll talk about a history that took place in this very building and others nearby and on this very lawn and in these streets and beyond the city limits. And the Brooks Baxter War was quite an event, to say the least, and I hope you all will come away with a better understanding of those unsettled months in 1874 and how it led to our current state constitution. So thank you again for sharing part of your Saturday with us, and please enjoy the show. And next I'd like to welcome Marty Ryle up here, who is our Director of the Division of Arkansas Heritage. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephanie, and good morning. And I too want to welcome everyone to the Old State House. You know, this museum is one of 8 agencies that fall under the umbrella of Arkansas Heritage, which is a division of course, Parks, Heritage, and Tourism in our state government. But we're very particularly proud of this structure. As most of you probably know, this is the oldest standing Capitol building west of the Mississippi. And so it's very dear to us in our heart, and as you know, as many have said, oh, the story she could tell if she could only talk. Well, today she is going to talk with a little help from her friends of an event that happened here 150 years ago, and to help tell the story, along with the Old State House Museum, we have who you just met, Stephanie Wade, who's our director of the Historic Arkansas Museum. It's just down the street. If you haven't been there, I'm sure you have, but hope you'll go back. And many of the buildings that are there were standing at the time of this event. And Stephanie does a great job for us over there, and we're very proud they're collaborating on this event. We also have the Arkansas State Archives, which is a caretaker of so many of our precious state artifacts and documents. And David Ware, who you'll hear from in just a few moments, is our director over there and the state historian. And so he's here to help tell the story. And then, of course, as I mentioned, Old State House, Daniel Cockrell, who you will hear from here next, I believe, is the director of the Old State House Museum and does a tremendous work. But today's event's a collaboration of those 3 agencies within the Heritage umbrella. So we're very proud that they're all working together on this to bring you Anarchy in Arkansas. Of course, it's a historic event in 1874 that it led to our present-day state constitution and shaped our state government for generations to come. So we're pleased to have you here with us today. I'll close with saying, again, welcome, glad you're here, and thank you for your support of Arkansas Heritage and the stories that we have to tell. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Marty, and thank you, Stephanie, and thank you, everyone, for coming to this. I was mentioning to many of these people, we've been working on this project for about 10 years. Mrs. Nash has been coming in for some time and sharing with us artifacts and stories, and so it's a culmination of this, and we're here for the commemoration of this event. It's the 150th year, so I'm going to introduce our guest speakers who will join us later. Dr. Tom DeBlack is here, ladies and gentlemen. Tom, wave everybody there. Thank you very much. Mark Christ is here. I'm going to save you the readings because you can read that. Kelly Houston Jones is here, folks. Thank you, Kelly. And then Charley has slipped me. I don't know where he is. There, Charley Sandage is here as well. And they're going to share with us their insight and research on the things that we're going to present to you in primary source documentation form. So I'm going to cut my remarks short, and thank you on behalf of all the staff here at the Old State House Museum. We're really honored to have you here with us today for a very special occasion. Thank you. And I'm going to call it David.
They told me if this goes badly, it's going to turn into a necktie party for me, so I came equipped. Thank you all for being here this morning. It's an honor and a delight to be able to have a group who are actually interested in one of the most significant events in Arkansas history. Let me say that you get to celebrate it or commemorate it in good company with the speakers we have lined up for you today. When I pitched this idea to Daniel and to Stephanie, thankfully they didn't laugh me out of the room, because they too saw the need to actually call attention to something that gave birth in many ways to much of modern Arkansas, certainly its government and its politics, the Brooks Baxter War of 1874, which effectively ended federal supervision of Arkansas, federal reconstruction in Arkansas. But there's more to it than simply politics. There's more to it than simply a little bit of violence in Markham Street. And when we were pitching this idea to Marty, he was asking me, well, what do you have in mind? What's it all about? And so at an 8 o'clock Tuesday morning meeting, I'm not sure what came over me, but I mentioned, well, we're trying to do what Shakespeare did. And I realized after the fact that, wait a minute, that's appropriate, because as far as I'm concerned, the first public historian was William Shakespeare. Back in 1590, we see the performance of his first historical play, Henry IV, Part 2. Part 1 would follow several years later. Historians were not always good on chronology. A few years later, 1599, sees the debut of perhaps the greatest work of historical drama, certainly that came from Shakespeare's pen, maybe from many others, Henry V, which takes the story of a sort of a troubled youth turned surprisingly modern monarch and makes it into gold. We cannot touch Shakespeare's standard, but this story, the Brooks Baxter War story, is worthy of Shakespeare. And so I started thinking, we've got drama, we've got comedy, we've got tragedy, and we have consequences, all of the things that make Shakespeare's great history plays live for centuries. So we're doing our part here at 150 years on to help kick that story down a little bit further. So hopefully our grandchildren will say, wait a minute, there's something worth finding out about in this story. So perhaps it's not out of place to imagine how Shakespeare would have approached this story. And his historical plays begin with a prologue. Therefore, so shall ours. Oh, for a muse of fire that would ascend the brightest heaven of invention, a state house for a stage, contenders to act, and a president austere and distant to behold the swelling scene. Then should solid Elisha and the mercurial Joseph assume the port of Mars, and at their heels, leashed in like hounds, should judges, publicans, and militia crouch for employment. But pardon, gentles all, we scholars and strollers who have dared on this mass platform to bring forth so great an object. Can this venerable floor hold the muddy plains of New Gascony? Within this brick-built square, can we cram the very muskets that did dispute the air of old Palarm? Well, have patience, and since a crooked figure, a comma to you, may make a little number into a great deal, let us ciphers to this great account on your imagination depend and work. Suppose now that within the girdle of these walls are confined two mighty factions, whose high upreared and quarrelsome partisans narrow Markham Street parts asunder. Piece out our imperfections with your thoughts. Into 100 militia divide each of us, and make of them imaginary companies. Think when we talk of steamboats that you see them roiling quick waters and besmoking the air, for 'tis your thoughts that must now quicken our characters. Carry them here and there, jumping over times, turning the deeds of weeks and months into an hourglass, for which supply, admit me, your chorus to this history, who prologue like your humble patience praise, gently to hear and kindly to judge our play.
This yours?
This is mine.
Good.
Paperwork is always a challenge. We begin with the deliberations of the Poland Committee, U.S. Congress, House of Representatives, summer of 1874, investigating affairs in Arkansas. Testimony on May 30th, 1874, by Arkansas Supreme Court Justice John McClure, questioned by the chairman, Representative Poland.
Go on and make a statement in reference to the condition of things in Arkansas, and give us a history of the cause of it, and in your own way.
Well, that will be very difficult to do without some indication on the part of the committee as to what ground you wish me to cover and as to how far back you propose me to go.
So far as I know from information in the papers, the difficulty seems to have grown out of your last election, and out of the disputes which grew out of it.
Yes, sir. Mr. Brooks and Mr. Baxter were both candidates for the office of governor in the fall election of 1872. The canvass was very active. Baxter was nominated or put in the field by the Republican Party proper. Brooks was nominated by what are called the Reform Republicans. The Democrats assembled in convention shortly afterward and gave Brooks's nomination a quasi-endorsement. That is the political status of the case.
Was the writ of ouster issued before Brooks took possession?
There was not any writ of ouster issued. The judgment itself ousts.
The mere rendition of the judgment ousts?
Yes, so far as the ouster is concerned, it gives to the man the office. Outside of that, if a party refuses to give up the books and papers that pertain to the office, further proceedings are to be taken. The office is one thing, and the records of the office are another.
From the New York Herald and read in Washington at breakfast the same day. Little Rock, Arkansas, April 15th, 9 p.m. In the case of Brooks versus Baxter in the Nissi Prius Court of Little Rock Circuit brought last summer stating that Baxter was a usurper, Circuit Judge Wytock at 10 o'clock this morning overruled the demurrer of plaintiff to the jurisdiction and issued a writ of ouster. This occurred in the absence of Governor Baxter's counsel. Chief Justice McClure immediately administered the oath of office to Brooks, and soon after, Sheriff Oliver served a writ on Governor Baxter at the executive office. He was accompanied by Brooks and an armed guard. Brooks demanded possession of the office, was refused, and then declared himself in forcible possession. Brooks's friends had possessed themselves of the Capitol, had broken into the state armory and seized guns and ordnance. Brooks sent word to say he had not seen your correspondent yet. Capitol halls are filled with excited groups. Governor Baxter, on leaving the State House, went to the Anthony House and held a consultation with his friends and counsel, then drove to St. John's College on the outskirts of the city. The Brooks party are jubilant and defiant. It is asserted that the coup d'etat was planned by Messrs. Clayton and Dorsey when here at Easter, after failing to agree with Governor Baxter regarding the management of the fall elections. I went to Baxter's headquarters in St. John's College at 3 o'clock. The entrance was guarded. Baxter said to your correspondent that he would act vigorously, that he had plenty of arms at his disposal at the United States Arsenal. Baxter is organizing the militia. General Robert C. Newton will call out the militia. There will probably be bloodshed if the government allows them to fight it out. The State House and grounds are well guarded tonight with over 300 Brooks men under arms. There is great excitement here, and the people from the country are arriving in masses.
Our next speaker is Professor DeBlack.
Thank you, David. It's always a great honor to be in this magnificent building we're so fortunate to have in this state, and for it still being in continual use all these years later. And I want to say a thank you to Daniel Cockrell for his administration of it. Thank you. I'm going to talk a little bit today about the major players, and then leave it to Chris to talk about what many of them did. And as you will not be surprised to know, the major players were Joseph Brooks and Elisha Baxter. Joseph Brooks, born in Ohio, 1821, Methodist preacher. At 18, circuit rider in Iowa and Indiana, editor of a Methodist anti-slavery paper. came to Arkansas in 1863 as a chaplain of a black regiment, whose colonel was his brother, William Brooks. William was killed in action at Wallace Ferry in Phillips County. Joseph stayed in Phillips County after the war, made some money in the cotton business, and became involved in liberal Republican politics. I know that grates on the ear today, but there was at one time a liberal Republican party, and Brooks became one of its leaders. He was a major speaker at the Constitutional Convention of 1868 and was wounded in the assassination attempt that killed Congressman James Hines. As I said, he's a very forceful speaker. As a matter of fact, and I think this is in your program, one of his followers said that hearing Brooks speak reminded him as a child of a brindle bull that bellowed so loudly it scared all the other cattle. In 1871, Brooks announced his intention to run for governor. And Google says that's a brindle-tailed bull, so I'm going to go with that. Elisha Baxter, a North Carolina native, moved to Batesville in 1852, which apparently if you moved to Arkansas before the war and then became a Republican after the war or before the war, even if you moved here before the war, then you later became a carpetbagger, or a scalawag rather, not a carpetbagger. So Baxter will be referred to as a scalawag, Brooks as a carpetbagger by their opponents. Elisha Baxter served 2 terms in the state legislature. His politics are really hard to decipher. He was a one-time Whig who had supported Thomas Heineman, but unlike Heineman, he opposed secession. When the Federals occupied Batesville in 1862, he was offered a commission in the Union Army, which he refused. When the Confederates reoccupied Batesville, he fled to Missouri. But in 1863, he was captured by a Confederate raiding party led by Colonel Robert Newton. Remember that, Colonel Robert Newton. And he was returned to Arkansas to stand trial for treason. Now, one historian has called Baxter and his career timid. I don't know where that comes from, because his wartime experiences were anything but timid. After he was brought back to Little Rock and imprisoned, friends helped him to escape. He fled to Union lines in Missouri, recruited a mounted infantry regiment and became its colonel. And after the war, served on the Supreme Court under Isaac Murphy and was a supporter of Powell Clayton. One of his supporters had once belonged to a minstrel troupe, and so the Baxter faction, the Brooks Baxter War, would be called the Minstrels. So the Brindletails and the Minstrels. He was the nominee of the regular Republican Party in 1872. Now, it's impossible to talk about this period at all without mentioning this guy, Powell Clayton, who was the dominant political figure in Arkansas in the years after the Civil War. During the war, Clayton had been generally considered to be the best cavalry commander in the Union Army west of the Mississippi. He settled here after the war, became active in Republican politics, elected governor in 1868, was governor during the violence inspired by the Ku Klux Klan, and one historian has said that Clayton, quote, accomplished more than any Southern governor in suppressing the Ku Klux conspiracy. Clayton was also very politically astute, and he saw that when the restrictions on voting were lifted, that the Democrats were going to come back to power. And so in 1871, he saw it and was elected by the legislature to the U.S. Senate. He originally supported Baxter, but then later switched to Brooks for reasons that I'm sure someone's going to talk about. I mentioned this man earlier, Robert C. Newton, who had arrested Elisha Baxter during the Civil War. Ironically, when Baxter is governor and forms a state militia, who does he get to be the head of the state militia? The same Robert C. Newton who had arrested him for treason during the war. So a former Confederate is now leading the state militia. Meanwhile, the Brooks forces, military forces, were led by James Fagan, a former Confederate general, and Robert Catterson, a former Union colonel. So see, these are some of the major players. I'm particularly proud of this next player. And my friends will tell you that I don't like to brag on myself, but this was quite a get, because I was able to secure someone, a player who was involved in the Brooks Baxter War, to be with us today. Now, that's 150 years ago. That's pretty good, folks. You got to admit. And she will be greeting you as you leave today, and her name is Lady Baxter. A 64-pound naval gun during the Civil War on the Confederate gunboat Pontchartrain ends up somehow in the mud and is recovered by the Baxter forces and used by them. It wasn't used, actually, was never fired in anger, but was in possession of the Baxter forces during this conflict. Other prominent figures, Augustus Garland, who would later become governor, and U.M. Rose, Uriah Milton Rose, prominent Little Rock lawyers who supported Baxter. Baxter and Garland had become good friends, and Baxter sought to use Garland to solidify his claim to the governorship. Garland later said, it doesn't really matter which of these two is governor. What matters is a return to full participation and stability in government. Meanwhile, two Arkansans now living in Washington, D.C., former family member Robert Ward Johnson and former Whig Albert Pike supported Baxter's cause in Washington, D.C. And I'm getting out a couple of my favorite characters in this. And I have to confess, I didn't have, the only image I had of John McClure was a very bad image. And I got a hold of David Ware 2 days ago and said, "You have anything?" And of course, the Arkansas Archives came through. John McClure, born in 1834 in Ohio, an attorney who came to Arkansas when the Civil War was ending. A newspaper in Cincinnati near his home reported that McClure had acquired his legal abilities, quote, in bar rooms, at poker tables, and on the race course. When the Civil War began in 1861, he enlisted at the age of 27 as a first lieutenant and quartermaster of the 57th Volunteer Regiment of the Ohio Infantry. War records are confusing about his military career, but we do know that he was court-martialed and relieved of duty for playing cards. This would lead to a nickname that would stick with him throughout his career, Poker Jack McClure. He rented a cotton plantation near the Arkansas River east of Pine Bluff, and when that failed, he briefly worked as an agent of the Freedmen's Bureau, set up by the federal government to help former slaves, and then moved to Little Rock to practice law. He had a great fondness for gambling. With his bushy beard, wild hair, elegant black knee-length frock coat, broad-brimmed black hat, and ever-present cigar, McClure was Chief Justice of the Arkansas Supreme Court during Reconstruction. And of course, he's going to be the one who swears in Joseph Brooks as governor. John Gould Fletcher, writing in 1947, said he is described him this way: the bushy-bearded radical, a tall, raw-boned Midwestern lawyer who perpetually smoked cigars and was cynically profane in conversation. My other favorite character in this whole affair is a man named Hercules King Cannon White. Hercules King Cannon White. Now, if your name is Hercules King Cannon White, you damn well better be colorful. And he was. There's a picture of him in your program, but that picture is of an older King Cannon White. I happened to find one of Hercules King Cannon White as a young man. As you can see, he was a very virile fellow. Okay, that's not Hercules King Cannon. This is Hercules King Cannon. John Harrell, who was alive at the time, historian John Harrell, called White, quote, the most conspicuous figure next to Brooks and Baxter, who took part in the Brooks Baxter War. White was a Kentucky native who had run away from home at age 15 to fight for the Confederacy. He fought in both the regular Confederate Army and with Confederate guerrillas. After the war, he moved to Pine Bluff to live with relatives. Served as a private tutor and studied law, got his law license in 1868. And John Harrell, writing in 1893, he had known White, described him this way. He was about 28 years of age in 1874, raw-boned, red-haired, and freckled. He married in Pine Bluff, and soon after the surrender, a granddaughter of ex-Governor Roane. He allied himself with Powell Clayton in the early days of Reconstruction and was made prosecuting attorney of his district by Clayton. Entering with apparent zest, Hercules King Cannon White entered into everything he did with zest. Into the organization of the Republican Party in his county, the large majority of whom were Negroes. He acquired an ascendancy of the people of that race in Arkansas, and Mark's going to talk about this, but he was apparently the most popular white figure in all of Jefferson County. Had a strong following among African Americans. Harrell went on to say that White was, quote, a man of unusual strength of intellect and originality, full of resources, energy, and audacity, and so frank and fearless in his manner with men that he controls them by sheer force of will and dash. He runs over them, as it were. He concluded that White was, quote, a ready and impressive speaker and a skillful debater at the bar or in the party convention. After his participation in the Brooks Baxter War, White would return to Pine Bluff. He would serve 6 turbulent terms as mayor of Pine Bluff. He ran on a platform of cleaning up gambling and saloons and corruption in government in Pine Bluff. He did rather well in cleaning up corruption. His crusade against drinking and gambling was somewhat less successful, as he himself enjoyed frequenting saloons and gambling. But Mark's going to talk to you about his role here and why he's such a colorful character in this conflict. And then finally, Ulysses Grant, President of the United States, is going to be called on by both sides to intervene and rule in their favor. He was hesitant to do so. He had intervened in a disputed election in Louisiana in 1872, for which he had been roundly criticized by his opponents. Here's an anti-Grant cartoon some years later from Leslie's Illustrated Newspaper showing Grant, sort of a swaggering military guy with a cannon strapped to his horse, and you'll note that a signpost pointing toward Arkansas. So both sides appealed to Grant to intervene, as well as many private citizens had implored him. They were tired of the violence. They were tired of the instability. And so 1 month to the day after the Brooks Baxter War began, May 15th, 1874, Grant, convinced that serious violence was imminent, telegraphed his support for one of these two men. Now I'll leave it to Mark, Chris, to tell you which one.
Thank you.
A proclamation by Governor Joseph Brooks, April 15th, 1874.
Being in the office, it is very odd, to some extent, to find my policy, which appears to Elisha Baxter, no doubt, misrepresented, for the purpose of advancing personal interest and gratifying their ambition. For my political tenets, I respectfully refer you to the platform of the Reform Party, on which I was a candidate in 1872. From the principles there enunciated, I have not departed, and God helping me, I never will. Efforts, no doubt, will be made by designing me to convey the impression that is immediately equal to rally the standard of a man who, no doubt, will claim he is the governor of Arkansas, that you all know was not elected, and who has not more right or claim to the office than any one of you have, there was not a candidate for the purpose of placing that man in the executive office. I say frankly to you that all such attempts will lead to strife and bloodshed. For I shall resist and suppress the action of all mobs that may assemble together under the banner or at the call of Elisha Baxter. No man in the state more deeply regrets strife and bloodshed than myself, but doing as I do, that self-government rather than self-grandness is in the issue, I shall avoid every means to maintain its supremacy. Elisha Baxter portioned me the legislature of the courts, and by the judgment of the courts of competent jurisdiction, I am the executive office. When it is adjudicated that I am not illegal, I will bow my head in silence to the decree of the court, be it what it may. The power that Elisha Baxter used to portion me to the courts, I will use to make him respect and abide its decrees. To one and all I say, keep quiet and pursue your different vocations. Your services are not needed in the capital to preserve either peace or good order. Should the time come when they will be needed, you'll be notified in due time through proper channels. Joseph Brooks.
And in response, a proclamation by Governor Baxter.
The people of Arkansas, an insurrection organized in the interest of certain parties has effected a seizure of the capital and now begins to usurp the functions of government. The momentary success of this insurrection, as far as regards the occupation of the building, has been owing to that security which the political traditions of the American people give to legitimate government in time of peace. Aversion to unnecessary bloodshed has, for a few hours, withheld the arm of the state government from the immediate vindication of its rights and dignity. Forbearance has seemed only to embolden the impudence of the handful of insurgents. Forbearance, therefore, is at an end. An appeal lies, of course, to the Supreme Court of the state. That court has already, in a case of popular issue, determined that the court has no authority to decide the validity of elections of any executive officer of the state. It need hardly be remarked that pending an appeal, the effective judgment of the Circuit Court of West County is suspended, and that the undertaking to sustain the enforcement of that judgment pending the appeal is without color of law or moral obligation. Forcible ejection of the chief magistrate to the premises was followed by prearranged and prompt summons to armed desperados. To bar all access to the State House by its dear doctors, Mr. Brooks has issued a paper entitled A Proclamation, in which he distinctly announces the intention of bloodshed. The executive of the state has but one obligation to perform. The authority of the law will be immediately and effectively asserted, peaceably, if it may be, but asserted immediately. The government proposes to occupy the capital. Under the solemn obligations of my oath of office, I renew my promise to be true to the people. I ask from them the support to which they owe to the Chief Magistrate, Elisha Baxter, Governor of Arkansas.
Thank you, Governor. We now hear from the Attorney General of the United States, George Williams.
Department of Justice, Washington, April 16, 1874. Honorable Elisha Baxter, Little Rock, Arkansas. I am instructed by the President to say in answer to your dispatch of him yesterday, asking for the support of the general government to sustain you in your efforts to maintain the rightful government in the state of Arkansas, that in the first place your call is not in conformity with the Constitution and laws of the United States. In the second place, that as the controversy relates to your right to hold a state office, its education, unless a case is made under the so-called Enforcement Act, belongs in the state courts. If the decision of which you complain is erroneous, there appears to be no reason why it may not be reviewed and the correct decision obtained from the Court Supreme of the state. George H. Williams, Attorney General. Department of Justice, Washington, April 16, 1874. Honorable Joseph Brooks, Little Rock, Arkansas. I am instructed by the President to say in answer to your dispatch to him of yesterday, asking that the United States commanding officer at the arsenal be instructed to deliver the arms in his custody belonging to the state to you, or to hold them subject to your order. That he declines to comply with your request, and he is not advised that your right to hold the office of governor has been fully and finally decided by the courts of Arkansas. George H. Williams, Attorney General.
And to make matters a little clearer, a note from the Postmaster General of the United States.
Washington, April 17, 1874. Letters addressed to Governor E. Baxter or Elijah Baxter, Governor, should be delivered to said Baxter. Letters addressed to Governor Brooks or Brooks, Governor, should be delivered to Brooks. Letters addressed Governor of Arkansas, you will hold until further orders. John A. J. Cresswell, Postmaster General.
And that settles that. We take you now to events of April 21st before the Anthony House on Markham Street in Little Rock. Let us say a dialogue between Governor Baxter and Colonel King White, the hero of Jefferson County.
Soldiers, I am in point of fact too unwell to address an audience, but there is an emergency. There is an insurrection. The government has been seized. The archives are in the hands of the insurgents. I have called you here for the purpose of asserting not the rights of Elijah Baxter, but the rights of sovereign citizens of the state of Arkansas.
Hurrah!
The seizure of the archives was effected without my ever having been served the process of court. I am making preparations. I intend to assert my right as far as respects government function of the executive to govern the state of Arkansas.
Hurrah for Baxter! Thieves to the rear!
Just tell us whether you're going to have us take that state house or not.
I ask you, gentlemen, to be patient and quiet. Conduct yourselves orderly as good soldiers, such as I am going to be. In due time, proper orders will be given to you to assert the rights of the state. Thank you.
Governor Baxter, I did not come here, of course, to make a speech. I came here to assist in reinstating what I consider to be the legally constituted authorities of the state of Arkansas. I have brought with me here a number of colored men. It has been said, sir, that these colored men will prove treacherous to you. I now ask these colored men in your presence and in the presence of this assemblage whether we will stand firm to Elisha Baxter.
We will. Try us.
I am here, Governor Baxter, for the purpose, if necessary, of surrendering my life to reinstate the lawful authority of the government of the state. Furnish us simply with the means. Give us the authority. Pronounce the order. And I will guarantee you, sir, that in 25 minutes from the time the order is written, Joseph Brooks will either be in hell or in the archives. I have a force here of men who will fight, sir. Summoned from their fields, taken from their plows, every one of them. They are anxious to go home, but I say to you now, as I've said to you before, let it take us 1 day or 1 year. The colored people commanded by myself and Colonel Harris and the other officers of this command will stand by you until you are recognized as the governor of the state of Arkansas.
Hooray!
Hooray!
That is all I have to say, sir. I know that you and your good judgment and the officer commanding us in good and proper time will give us the order. All we ask is that the time and those orders will soon come.
Great cheering erupts.
Hooray for King White!
Hurrah for King White!
Colonel White, I wish to say in response to your remarks that for one, I have never for one instant doubted the patriotism and loyalty of these colored men who stand before me. I well know that the attempts have been made to change their sentiments and attitudes, but in the midst of it, all they stand is firm as a rock to rock. Amen.
Woo!
And allow me to say to you now, that given the condition of my health, I must be permitted to exhort you, in conclusion, be patient, conduct yourself orderly, and have no fears for the consequences.
And now a word from the Honorable Mark Christ.
Curious if they have any questions thus far.
By the way, the master of the house asks me to deliver to you the invitation. Do you have any questions thus far? Is everything clear?
It's gonna get murky.
Remember, there's a reason they skip over this in Arkansas history
ask
class.
the questions now and then pause for a long time. I'm glad we're all clear. We're on the same page. Please proceed, sir.
Well, I'm going to follow up a little bit on what Tom said. So, I'm a Civil War historian. This is a little outside of my wheelhouse, but it's really interesting how some of the key players from the Civil War in Arkansas had major roles in the Brooks Baxter War. Powell Clayton, of course, the great cavalryman, was a supporter of Brooks, as was Colonel Catterson. And James Fagan, who was a major general for the Confederacy, was also with Brooks. But more of the former Confederates appear to have followed Baxter. You have Thomas Dockery up there on the left, Albert Pike, who was doing his thing in Washington, Thomas Churchill, who had served in Arkansas, and of course Robert Newton, who had actually arrested and imprisoned Baxter during the Civil War. So politics makes strange bedfellows. So while saw nowhere near the carnage visited on Arkansas by the Civil War, the Brooks Baxter War nonetheless witnessed numerous acts of violence and a few sharp skirmishes before President U.S. Grant ended it and Reconstruction. The election of 1872 was rife with irregularities, but resulted in Elisha Baxter assuming the governorship of Arkansas. Following a series of legislative and legal maneuvers, losing candidate Joseph Brooks won a legal ruling declaring him the winner, and on April 15, 1874, Brooks and a group of armed followers confronted Baxter in this building, the old State House, and threw him out, leading to several weeks of armed confrontation, what became known as the Brooks Baxter War. And it's just really cool to be, having this program in this building where all of this happened. I just love it. So as the political crisis grew, partisans on both sides began preparations for armed conflict. Brooks' adherents seized guns and ammunition from the arsenal, while other troops and weapons were delivered by steamboat. Baxter forces dug up an abandoned 64-pounder siege gun, originally from the CSS Pontchartrain, named it Lady Baxter, and pointed it toward the Capitol. And of course, we can all say hi to Lady Baxter on our way out today. So Hercules King Cannon White led militia troops, mostly black, from Pine Bluff to Little Rock on April 18, 1874. On the early evening of April 21, he marched his troops to Baxter in his headquarters at the Anthony House, which would have been on the southwest corner of Markham and Scott Streets, and offered their services, saying, and I won't do it as well as Ian, but saying, "Furnish us with the means, give us the authority, pronounce the order, and I will guarantee you, sir, that in 25 minutes from the time the order is written, Joseph Brooks will either be in hell or the archives," which was met with riotous cheers from his followers. And why he equated hell and the archives, I have no idea. I'll defer to Dr. Ware on that. So while Baxter urged White and his followers to show restraint, Colonel Thomas E. Rose, who was commander of the U.S. troops in the Capitol, asked White if he was going to attack Brooks at the old State House. Rose's horse stumbled into some of White's musicians, and in the confusion that followed, shots rang out, and David F. Schall, an ex-Confederate and real estate broker, was shot and killed as he stood in the Anthony House. So just guy was in the wrong place at the wrong time. This was the first significant violence of the Brooks Baxter War. So after that, Rose went ahead and placed men of the 16th Infantry Regiment with artillery on Markham Street to block the area between the State House and the Anthony House and try and keep the belligerents from attacking each other. So Hercules King Can and White and his men were sent back to their base at Pine Bluff. And White learned on April 30 that a large group of Brooks supporters, led by Joseph L. Murphy and a Captain Vandesan, had gathered at New Gascony. And as one historian stated, White, chafing under a forced inactivity, decided to strike. And Captain Murphy, this is just as an aside, during the October 25, 1863 Battle of Pine Bluff, Murphy led Pine Bluff militia troops who supported Powell Clayton in his successful defense of the city. So anyways, White commandeered a steamboat, Belle of Texas, which had brought news of the Brooks troops, loaded about 150 white and black militiamen aboard, and departed for New Gascony, about 16 miles below Pine Bluff on the Arkansas River. When they passed Nichols Landing, they saw a group of Brooks men seizing livestock, so White sent his 100 white cavalrymen after them and proceeded toward New Gascony with his remaining troops, 50 black infantrymen. Reuniting at New Gascony, the force headed for Ashley's Gin, about 4 miles away. There they found Murphy and Vandesan's men formed in line of battle behind a worm rail fence at the Gin. And as the Arkansas Gazette reported, the fighting commenced, lasting for 30 minutes, the firing being hot and the rattling of musketry being continuous. White finally ordered a cavalry charge, and the Brooks supporters broke and ran. The Baxter troops gathered about 60 prisoners, including Murphy and Vandesan, both of whom had been wounded. And the Brooks supporters, casualty counts vary, but at least 9 of White's men were wounded. From 7 to 9 of Murphy's men were killed, and around 20 to 30 wounded in the largest single military action that took place during the Brooks Baxter War. Murphy was jailed in what one contemporary observer called White's Bastille at Pine Bluff. So next up, the Halley, a light draft packet steamer, steamed to Fort Smith in late April, where the Arkansas Gazette reported it was detained for 48 hours, waiting on about 60 refugees who wanted to come down and get something to eat from Joe in the State House. On the way down, they would not let her land at Lewisburg for fear there might be a Baxter reception committee waiting for them. The Halley was in Little Rock for 2 days when Robert C. Newton, the general of Baxter's forces, ordered it upriver to inspect a shipment of weapons that Brooks backers had seized from the Arkansas Industrial Institute, which of course now is the University of Arkansas at Fayetteville. Those weapons were reported heading to the capital via flatboat. Between 30 and 40 men from Captain Alexander Welch's militia company, which was later known as the Halley Rifles, and the commands of Captain Jack Cottrell and Captain O.S. Mask boarded the steamboat and set off toward Fort Smith on May 7, 1874. So James Fagan, former Confederate Major General commanding Brooks's force at the Capitol, learned of the Halley's departure and ordered Colonel John Jack Brooker to take 6 companies of their militia and board a special train west to intercept the steamboat. The 200 men disembarked at the mouth of Palarm Creek on May 8 and took position along the banks of the Arkansas River. The Halley, after stopping at natural steps to gather wood, approached the ambush. A Lieutenant Grove from Brooker's troops met the vessel and ordered the Halley to return to Little Rock. The steamboat's captain, Sam Houston, quote, answered him with his usual brusqueness and signaled the pilot to go ahead, according to John Harrell's history of the Brooks Baxter War. The Brooks forces opened a murderous fire on the Halley as the Baxter forces fired back from behind barricades of thick planks and cotton bales. A shot cut the Halley's steam pipe, leaving it to drift uncontrolled to the southern bank of the river, and the vessel was riddled by rifle fire. On the Halley, a man named Frank Timms was killed instantly. Houston was mortally wounded, and pilot John Myers was shot in the chest, knee, and calf, and he would die of his wounds on June 20. At least 3 other Baxter supporters were wounded. One, Bascom Lee, was left crippled in the fight. At least 3 Brooks men were killed or mortally wounded. So the survivors from the Halley escaped into the woods and made their way back to Little Rock. Brooker put 2 officers and 24 men aboard the steamboat and to sail it back to the capital, while the rest of the men returned by railroad. Early in the morning on May 10, the Halley was scuttled in the Arkansas River during a raid by Baxter supporters Both sides blamed each other for the sinking. Other violence broke out in other parts of the state. On May 3, some of the ubiquitous whites men fought 60 Brooks followers near Arkansas Post, routing them and killing 5 people. On May 10, White sent some of his cavalry to Argenta on the north side of the Arkansas River, along with Baxter volunteers from Lone Oak, to where they could attack Brooks men who were unloading needle guns and supplies from the steamboat Danville behind us, bringing it up to the Arkansas, the old State House. They took position on the Cairo and Fulton railroad lines, and soon some of Brooks' followers crossed the river to confront them. According to John Harrell, about 8:30, the firing was rapid on both sides, and the riverbank lined with citizens watching the skirmish. Colonel Rose sent U.S. troops to the railroad shops at Bering Cross and set up artillery at the foot of Louisiana Street to cover the low-lying land at Argenta. And I really feel sorry for Colonel Rose. I mean, this guy had a really hard job just trying to keep the violence from getting too extreme. So Baxter's men established a stronghold in the Fort Smith and Little Rock Railroad shops, and Brooks' troops charged and tried to drive them out as, quote, the workmen who remained in the shops lay on the floor to avoid the bullets. Brooks' troops suffered 1 dead and 2 wounded in the engagement, while 4 of Baxter's followers were wounded. 2 days later, the steamboat Robert Semple, reportedly carrying more volunteers for Baxter, landed just above the Bering Cross Bridge, and which is by what is now the Department of Arkansas Heritage headquarters. And Brooks' followers were ordered toward the boat. Soon, quote, skirmishers were deployed on both sides and firing commenced. Brooks' men took up positions in some old rifle pits there by Union Station, which is now the old train station here in Little Rock, while Baxter infantry set up positions on 5th, 6th, and 7th Streets, and Hercules White's cavalry occupied the high ground around the state penitentiary and Deaf-Mute Institute. So next time you're at the state capitol, realize that you're in a Brooks Baxter War battlefield. Brooks men, okay. For 2 or 3 hours, the firing was very heavy, rendering the streets unsafe for pedestrians and frightening families whose houses were struck by bullets. U.S. troops double-timed from Broadway to break up a final skirmish at the corner of 2nd and Spring Streets, but it had ended when they arrived, as had the day's combats. So the violence pretty much ended on May 15, 1874, when President Ulysses S. Grant signals his support for Baxter, who returned to the old State House on May 19, ending the Brooks Baxter War and signaling the end of Reconstruction in Arkansas. The Gazette reported on May 17 that Murphy and Van de Zandt, who had fought Baxter's men at New Gascony, laid down their, quote, civil commissions at the feet of Governor Baxter, asking pardon for their transgressions, stating that if their pardons were granted, they will depart the state never to return. We are gratified to state that the proposition of Murphy and Van de Zandt was accepted by the governor, who is first in peace as well as war, and as humane as he is determined. A month later, though, the newspaper reported that Murphy was being tried for treason in connection with his activities during the Brooks Baxter War. Initially denied bail, Murphy was freed on a $1,000 bond on June 23, 1874. The final outcome of the court proceedings is unclear. And it is estimated that in the various acts of violence during the Brooks Baxter War, as many as 200 people were killed around Arkansas. So that's the military end of things. I would be happy to answer any questions.
All right, so the question was, where was the governor's office at this time? And it would be in the West Wing. And if you guys are familiar with the building or not, go out there. There's a green screen on a wall in a corner. That's the historic governor's office, is that room there. And so, and then across the stairwell outside would have been the Attorney General's office. So we hear some stuff about the Attorney General's stuff going on as well. One more note, you mentioned these guys being shot. Tom found some stuff months back about these gentlemen killed up at Farm who were buried on the grounds of the old State House. And we asked about it. Most likely, this would have been out there on the banks of the river, and all that is excavated for La Harpe Avenue now. So those guys would have been dug up and then repatriated to where they're. But it was a great find, and we couldn't find any reference to it other than that brief mention that there were possibly some of these dead. They were just bringing them back to headquarters and sticking them in the ground so they wouldn't smell. Okay. Thank you.
Griffin?
Why did General Lincoln
I have no idea. I mean, I remember Daniel did a program on Reconstruction several years ago that opened with this just this crazy chart. Oh, okay.
Ladies and gentlemen, Mrs. Nash is a descendant of the Brooks family.
Yes.
Mark, Frank Hims is buried over at Mount Holly.
Okay.
And on his tombstone is the epitaph that he was killed on board the steamer Charley at Warren, Arkansas, with his face to the boat. We uncovered that the other day and cleaning one of the stones down there. But a couple of other things on the epitaph as well, that the stone was placed by the Alley Rifles, by his surviving
Comrades, good.
He's over at Mount Holly, if anybody wants to visit.
Okay, very good. Thank you. That's interesting. Yeah, Jan?
Mark, two questions for you. First of all, how the violence depended outside Little Rock depended on the river and the railroads. So I was wondering if you could for my first question, talk a little bit more about how the communication and transportation networks were in Arkansas at this time, how much of an influence they were on the violence. And my second question, did any of the family members, relatives of any of the people killed on either side, did they ever file charges, murder charges, property damage, anything like that in the courts?
Okay. Well, in answer to the first one, they would have had telegraphs and things like that, which would have gotten word around all through the state to where, they would know in Little Rock that there were needle guns being taken from the university in Fayetteville. As far as any kind of legal activity afterwards, I have no idea. I hadn't looked into that. So could have been. I don't know. Daniel? Okay.
Well, we'll get to the end of the story, but we talk about where no one gets arrested for taking over the state of Arkansas for a month. No offense, Mr. Nash, but he gets a promotion, right? To skip to the end of the story. So that kind of goes along. They're not going to arrest and try people for murder when no one did anything wrong. They were all just defending their principles. They just had, similar principles. It was strange.
There you go.
All right. So, anybody else got a question for Mark? It's a good open discussion.
Do it. Yeah. Well, I mean, there were black troops, militia on both sides, and Hercules also had white followers. So, yes.
Brooks and Baxter were both about half and half.
Half and half. Yeah. Oh, hang on. Yeah. Well, it was the 16th Infantry, but as far as the exact number, I couldn't tell you. It was probably a fairly small contingent, I would guess, where they really had to be moving around to try and head this stuff off. Yes, son.
I just thought the whole Lady Baxter story fascinating. There's been a couple of references to the salvage of the Lady Baxter. Tell folks a little bit about Black Spring.
Okay. Well, okay. So the gun that's now called the Lady Baxter was on the CSS Pontchartrain, which was one of two Confederate ironclad gunboats that served in Arkansas. The cannon were taken off of the Pontchartrain and put in the fortifications at Arkansas Post while they were trying to keep troops from coming up the Arkansas River when Arkansas Post was reduced by a federal attack. The Confederates later went back and salvaged what weapons they could, what guns they could, including the Lady Baxter, which was then placed in some of the fortifications guarding Little Rock, which fell on September 10, 1863. And somewhere around there, the gun got chunked into the river and was buried in the mud until they dug it up for this conflict here. Yes. Okay, they'll cover that later. Yeah, that's out of my bailiwick.
That's the end of the story, sir.
Yeah.
Give us a little time to build the rest of this.
We're going to read Grant's words about that. We're going to tell you that.
Okay. Yes.
I just can't help but notice that stealing the archives demonstrates a long tradition of controlling the media and designing the truth.
Well, and the archives were just really, really important in the 19th century. I think if you'll remember in 1862 when Sam Curtis's army was threatening Little Rock, Governor Rector packed up the archives and fled to Hot Springs. So, anyways.
They were in this building.
Yeah.
All roads lead to the old State House. All right, well, thank you all.
Yeah, thank you, Mark.
Before the memory fades, a bit of testimony from one of the Halley Rifles. Mr. E.W. Rector, speaking of the long walk home from Palarm.
Captain Welch and the men of his command, after the boat had landed or drifted to the south side of the river, went ashore and were soon aware that a body of cavalry had passed along the riverbank. And so, for fear of capture, took a bypath that led through a defile in the hills. We reached Maynard's in time for supper and were most hospitably entertained. After supper, I was somewhat acquainted with the country, and they had made me a guide and pushed me down the south side until opposite my father's plantation at Cabin Point. There we all crossed the river, 35 or 40 of us in a single canoe, 2 at a time, and we camped by a spring branch of the White Oak Bayou near old Jack Smith's house, a leader of the colored in that locality. At the McCann place on the White Oak, we were furnished with breakfast by Mr. John Collins, who had been proprietor of the Anthony House for many years. After breakfast, we marched along the roads and railroad tracks until we reached the Clenenden place opposite Little Rock. There, a scout of the cavalry sent by General Churchill met and escorted us into the Baxter camp.
The same narrative, Mr. Rector gave us a few words on the last of that transport of delight, the good ship Halley.
At about 3 on Sunday morning, the 10th, a party of Baxter men fired from the Red Mill at Stonewall Jackson, a colored guard, and thus brought out the Brooks Guard on the Halley near there during the melee. Baxter men who had crossed in the skiff scuttled the steamer Halley, which sank to the cabin deck. Trains on the Fort Smith and Little Rock Railroad stopped running on account of armed parties forcing their passage.
A letter from Pine Bluff, editors of the Gazette. Being silent on the aspects of the present complication thus far, and I would have remained so to the end, were it not for certain facts and sights I had to learn and witness this day and evening. In passing the State House at noon, I noticed a most motley throng of colored men, some carrying weapons, some engaged in preparing defenses, and some, and really the great majority, loafing and staring at each other and the passers-by on the sidewalk. I went to work and thought no more about it until I came downtown this evening and stopped at the Anthony House, where I noticed some of our best young men on guard. Passing into the hotel, I saw not only the most respectable, but the best of our citizens sojourning inside, awaiting Governor Baxter's orders. This, thought I, solved the problem. If Mr. Brooks can get, while nominally in power, only a few unprincipled office seekers and the vagrant portion of the population to adhere to his standard, while Governor Baxter, without power and a fugitive for the time being, has all the intelligence and respectability, not only of the city and country, but of the state adhering to his personal fortunes, then I, and so will every sane and rational man in the state that looks at it in this light, that Governor Baxter and his right and justice and the test corners might at his side. I am also credibly informed by some of my townspeople that 1,000 of them, good and true as I know them to be, are on their way to rally around the standard of the true Governor, Elisha Baxter. Respectfully, etc., a Pine Bluff citizen.
On those words, ladies and gentlemen, we bring down the curtain on the first act of Anarchy in Arkansas. We understand reliably that provisions are either here or on the way, and since an army marches on its stomach, so should an audience. Daniel, do you have anything to add to this?
Further questions or comments, please discuss amongst yourselves what's taken place so far, and we'll try to find.
I'd like to say that I am honored by having two people here who are associated with the school that gave me my first taste of Arkansas. Back in 1999 was the first time that I ever set foot in Arkansas, although I grew up listening to KAAY's Beaker Street late in the night up in the plains of Nebraska. As far as I could tell, there was only one business in Little Rock, Arkansas. That was the Little Barn Head Shop. I'm delighted to discover there's more to Little Rock than that. But at any rate, when my wife and I found out we were moving to Arkansas for her job, because I'm an historian after all, I found a one-year position at Arkansas Tech in Russellville. That was my introduction to Arkansas, and, you know, it stuck. I'm a damn Yankee. What can I say? I transitioned from carpetbagger during my time at Russellville. So I'm honored to be on the same program with a former member of the history faculty of Arkansas Tech, Tom DeBlack, who made me welcome back then, and the current member, a rising and eminent member of the current generation of Arkansas Tech's history faculty, Kelly Houston Jones. Over to you, Kelly.
So for this portion of the service, I'd like you to turn to your map. For a related project that I have been working on, I have a student worker print out a huge version of this map, and I taped it to the wall of my office. And I have highlighter of different colors, like coded to indicate different things. And what I had been doing with that project was tracking USCT veterans and their families and sort of seeing where they live after the war is over. And so an aspect of that project that didn't make it into the final version of the piece I was working on conveniently fit whenever I was invited to participate in this event. So I'm so pleased to find an audience interested in the part that is laying on the cutting room floor from this other project. So of course, as we've talked in this program today, the disputes among Republicans in power, Republican voters, black and white, as well as between Republicans and conservatives/Democrats, although it takes them a while to start using that label again after the war is over. This is, of course, embroiling the capital city in violence, and it's something that complicated the lives of black Little Rock residents, and of course, with the 1874 Constitution, it's going to complicate a lot more than those immediate concerns. So the stakes are very high. Both sides enjoyed support from former Union and former Confederates. Each side actively recruited black men to fight. And it's just a very confusing part of this whole drama. So as Brooks supporters seized the Capitol with a force of white and black militia, Brooks seemed to have been the preferred candidate, or I should say would-be governor, by African Americans. Like Isaac Gillum. Isaac Gillum had served in the 54th U.S. Colored Infantry. He was a militia captain for Brooks in this conflict. It seems to me, and I don't want to make too much of this because it's such a difficult aspect of our history to understand, but it seems that Black Little Rock and other Black Arkansans, Black Little Rock residents and other Black Arkansans may have seen Brooks as the less conservative aspect, okay, of this conflict. He had appeal for them, certainly related to the fact that he had been a chaplain, for a USCT regiment. Elisha Baxter also commanded some Black support, but he ended up with a reputation as being perhaps less progressive than Brooks when it comes to rights for African Americans. Baxter managed to, and this doesn't fit with the way he sort of began his political career, or I should say, his post-war Reconstruction, this multifaceted Republican Party in Arkansas after the war. But Baxter seemed to have been able to win over former Democrats who had initially sided against him. So I'm still not doing a very good job of answering some of the questions that people had before to the previous presenters about why would someone choose one side over the other. But my read of this, and these are not numbers that I came up with, my reading of others who have written about the Brooks Baxter War was that Brooks had significantly more Black militia soldiers than Baxter did, that it wasn't quite even. But I'm willing to hear, we could dig and find out sort of where we're getting those. Now, one of the things that we can tell from this era is that the Gazette, Arkansas Gazette, supported Baxter. So a lot of the Baxter propaganda that we're hearing from the table here comes from the Arkansas Gazette. The paper casted Brooks supporters as loafing, that Brooks had managed to gather, quote, the blackest looking crowd that could very well be gotten together, and declared that the Baxter camp, by contrast, comprised, quote, the great body of the white people of all parties and a respectable backing from among the colored people. Now, whether we could take that at face value is, something to be debated, but as far as the Gazette was concerned, Baxter's forces were whiter, and Brooks was the element sort of courting the less honorable African American population from the way that's how the Gazette cast it. Another thing that the Gazette said about this was that the supporters for Brooks were drawn by, quote, the odor of civil rights, and they enjoyed, quote, the plunder and oppression under martial law. Okay, so there's a little bit of this kind of how the Gazette sees Brooks versus Baxter and a little bit of the landscape here for this. So while Brooks supporters, they're fortifying the grounds of this very place, right? They were having our symposium today. And then, of course, Baxter's faction, they get together at the Anthony House. And I think I got this from the Gazette, some supporters across the road at the Oddfellows building as well. So you have marked on your program where the Anthony House is, but it's a little different, I think, from what I have. And I brought my cheat sheet too. And I'm looking at it a little backwards, so I've got here.
That's Sister Ashley's house.
Am I pointing the wrong? It's kind of hard from the side. Okay, so it's going to be close to where it's close. But what I have is close, but not quite exactly where you've got it marked on your map. But that's really Markham is the important thing here, and you can see where Markham is. Okay. Okay, and so So having sort of set that up, or maybe just refreshing you on that, what I want to do is spend a little bit of time talking to you about what are other Black Little Rock folks doing? Like, how could this possibly have affected them? One of the flaws in our understanding of the Brooks Baxter War is that we talk about Black Arkansans in terms of militia participation, but not really much else. It's just hard to know much else, okay, about them. And so what I've got here is some information from the an 1871 Little Rock City Directory, which lines up okay with this map because this is 1871. The date I have on this map is 1871. Okay, so we can find out if I'm wrong about that. Now, of course, some things could have changed from the time that the information's gathered for the 1871 City Directory and the Brooks Baxter War, right, in 1874. But assuming that a lot of things are similar or the same, okay, then we can look here and see, like, sort of what else is happening, what else is located in these areas that we know of as being so contentiously fought over. There are some things, and I've got here, I'm calling this, it's sort of as if folks are caught in kind of a do-over of the Civil War in some ways, although the alignments are fuzzy, right? But we're fighting again, okay, in Arkansas. And one of the huge differences, though, is that while the United States Army presence in Little Rock during the Civil War was something that had clear, I'm going to put it, the USCTs were a essential source of strength, okay, of that force. And the United States loyalty is a central part of Black Arkansans' identities and roles, okay, in that area, in that era, and in this area. In the Brooks Baxter War, the U.S. Army kind of fades to the background a bit. And of course, it's not that they're doing nothing, but they are neither the protector of Black rights, Black futures, nor are they leaning heavily on Black soldiers for their very presence in the city. So that's, in such a short time, things have changed a lot, okay, in Little Rock, in the role, especially of Black men. But this is certainly scary for civilians. Black Little Rock residents had worked really hard since Steele's army came into the city, and of course several years have passed, but they have been able to, the best they can, make lives for themselves here. The old State House, I am probably going to have to step away from this. And I think I'm pointing, it's kind of weird sideways. Okay, so whenever we see that image of Blissville, the Alfred Wadd sketch, and it's got these cabins, and this was printed in the Harper's Weekly, and it described these wives of USCTs who had put together this village right here. For me, that's such a telling part of fast forwarding from 1866, when that sketch was published, to now here we are in 1874, and you've got Black civilians around the State House again, but they may be Brooks supporters, they may just be residents trying to find out what's going on, okay? And they are described in pretty negative terms by the Arkansas Gazette, but that's how we know they were there, at least. Sometimes you just got to read that stuff carefully. So much has changed, but the essential challenge of trying to be sort of full, freely moving citizens, they're just trying to work, they're just trying to be safe, get their business done day to day like everyone else, that's being disrupted here by the Brooks Baxter conflict. So of course, as the folks earlier than me on the program have said, you've got these street skirmishes between these factions. I'm going to stop bumping the podium. And so this is going to make the mobility that Black Little Rock residents they had worked very hard for more precarious. And so I wouldn't want to say that it's not also a dangerous time for white civilians. Of course it is. But my presentation is about black civilians, and I do think it wouldn't be too much of a stretch to say that black civilians are looked at more closely during this conflict than they would otherwise. And I've got some quotations from the newspaper for you on that. As historian Tom DeBlack has put it in his work, Main Street became the dividing line between these two opposing forces. Now, Main Street, according to the 1871 City Directory, had housed something like 20 black businesses. There was a confectionery at 23 Main Street, a black barber at 124 Main Street, a black restaurant at 209 Main Street, not to mention teamsters, shoemakers, blacksmiths, waiters, porters, and cooks. And so now I want to move over here to Markham. In case you guys couldn't see it, get your magnifying glass out. Okay. Oh, look, there we got a little mouse. Okay. So the interesting thing that I found, this is a lot of lead up, okay, for this 1871 directory, but one of the interesting things that I found was that there is maybe 20 black barbers right there on Markham. It is a barber fest. There are white and black barbers, but I'm talking about the black ones, okay? And this is actually a point I'll return to, is the interracial nature of the business district down there. The attorneys, the barbers, different types of services. The street is dotted with, it's back and forth. There's not really a black business district on Markham and then like a white one. It's pretty mixed up. Okay, so Alfred Kemp was at 13 East Markham, just for an example. There are also at least a dozen black laborers working at, which in 1871 would have been the Cook, Gibb and Company sawmill. So that must have been tough, that maybe they just didn't go to work, or I don't know, would have been tough for them to figure out how to navigate this. On 328 East Markham, upstairs in that building is where black Little Rock residents would have had access to the cashier of the Freedmen's Savings Bank. So the Freedmen's Savings Bank, I'm not sure if I know that sometime in the summer of 1874 that bank had folded, but I'm not sure if they would have still had an office in Little Rock or not during the Brooks Baxter War. But if they did, it's unlikely that people would have been brave enough, okay, to go and try to, make their deposits. I've also found who I think is a couple, Margaret and William Macklin. They live on 4th Street, and it's kind of one of those very 19th century things where you live, but you also have boarders, and so you've got these other rooms, and that's a way to sort of get some income. But it seems like next door is where William Macklin operates a bar, and then Margaret had a restaurant on Markham. And so that's a pretty good little business operation. You've got boarders, bar, and restaurant, okay? And so you can imagine them traveling from 4th Street, down to Markham for that. And so that certainly would have been something disrupted. Water Street is maybe not quite as relevant. There's some black businesses down here. Thomas P. Johnson's office was not exactly right across the road from the Capitol building, but a little bit off to, I guess that'd be the east. And then I've got seamstresses, washerwomen, other blacksmiths, people who would have had to come and go or pass through Markham to go, to do their business, to make money from their businesses and to go about their daily lives. Several black grocery stores on Main Street. There are white grocery stores also on Main Street. East Markham is pretty saturated with black businesses to about Scott. And that's, you can refer to your map and see okay, that's really the sort of heat of a lot of this. And then I'm not sure if I mentioned the attorneys. There are a couple of attorneys who live out on Arch, which I think I'm too I didn't realize this would be so hard from the side. I think I might be too zoomed in for Arch, but there are some attorneys who live on Arch Street, but then have their offices right down there on Markham, like across from the Capitol. So that's something to consider as well. Okay, so certainly citizens are frightened, and of course, as we heard, some people wounded in the crossfire of these shootouts at the intersection of Main and Markham, near the Capitol building. Some of this stuff, I don't want to repeat the stuff that I said here, but I can quote from the Arkansas Gazette advising citizens, all the stores were closed today, and there was no attempt to do any business. Women and children living in the vicinity of the State House have moved away. The editor also cautioned, thinking it may be unsafe for ladies to attempt to pass through the Baxter lines, the commanders request that they do not attempt it. So, of course, that warning, like they're talking about white women's safety, but if you're warning a certain segment of the population to avoid an area, then that means it's dangerous for everybody. There were reports circulated that a black woman had been shot to death trying to pass through Baxter's pickets. And of course, this danger reaches across to Argenta, and there's a pocket of USCT veterans that I have followed who move to Argenta. They, many of them had been, encamped there before they mustered out, and they'll make their homes there in Argenta. So when we have these shootouts that were mentioned earlier, shooting across the river at each other, there are some residents who are pretty terrified by that as well. And then some more shootouts that have really been covered. So one of the things that we find in the Brooks Baxter conflict is, like I mentioned before, the Gazette really goes to town against black residents, really just taking advantage of this chaos to get in some digs against black Little Rock residents. One article claimed that, quote, a gang of Brooks's darkies broke into the little store on 7th and Gaines, robbed the proprietors of their guns and wallets. Supposedly, a guard on the Baxter side accidentally shot his gun while he was on the corner of Scott and 2nd at 11 a.m. No one hurt, but an alarmed crowd had gathered. In the upheaval, the Gazette also made a big to-do of a man named Wesley Carter, a black man who allegedly broke into a grocery store on the corner of Main and 4th and was captured by U.S. soldiers on patrol. The Gazette took advantage of this moment, again, to take away from the reputation of some black troops as being brave, claiming that one group, while upriver for the Brooks side, because again, the Gazette, it's all, slanted that way, so we've got to be careful with it, I guess, that they had supposedly pillaged a plantation and were scared of the sound of the cracking of a stick. Many black families, and we know this, I think the most obvious place that we find this is in the WPA ex-slave interviews of the 1930s. Many black families in Arkansas remember the timing of their lives' events, not only in terms of whether they took place before or after the Civil War, but whether they occurred before or after the Brooks Baxter War. And indeed, sometimes you can find that they seem to be conflating the two when people are remembering stuff. A lot of times they're remembering things that happened when they were children, right? When Jane Harris married Austin Allen, he's one of those 54th U.S. Colored Infantry veterans, in 1874, the reverend who solemnized their marriage was too afraid of this political violence in Little Rock to register the marriage certificate with Pulaski County. This made it difficult for her pension application in 1889. When an examiner talked to this reverend, he said, "My recollection is that their marriage was a short time after the Brooks and Baxter War, and the clerk office of Pulaski County was at that time in the State House building where Baxter's soldiers were camped, and they were white men, unfriendly to colored men, who are known to be Brooks men," right? Because there's black supporters on both sides, but particularly, those who had opposed and had been Brooks men, and for that reason, there was no good feeling. And so he said, I did not care to be around them, and so he didn't file that marriage paperwork. So black residents who had supported Baxter would have been happy, okay, to see this sort of parade I'm fixing to describe. Brooks supporters would have been disappointed, okay, in this. But after recognition from Grant's administration, Elisha Baxter organized a review of his forces to publicly demonstrate the victory and claim downtown Little Rock. They formed a line on Markham Street at the head at Scott, extended this below Sherman. About 2,000 men, according to the Arkansas Gazette, who described it this way: the colored infantry formed on the left of the whites and the cavalry on the left of the blacks. 2 majors rode up and down, reviewing. They all marched up Scott to 5th, down 5th to Sherman, and then down Sherman to Markham, and up Markham to where they had started. So they're making kind of a loop. Maybe you guys can tell. I think I've got Sherman maybe a little bit off of my screen. But anyway, they make kind of a triangle, or I mean a little kind of a rectangle. There's also, after the conflict is over, the Gazette wrote that it will take some time yet to thoroughly cleanse the halls, and disinfectants will have to be freely used in the State House because of the Brooks presence that had been here. So this is definitely out of my wheelhouse, but just to try to, kind of tie this up, the Brooks Baxter War paves the way for the 1874 Constitution, which I think is going to be, discussed here. That is going to pave the way for a rollback of the promises of Reconstruction. That's a whole other symposium. And so this, again, is a grave moment, even if not everyone at the time understands quite what the implications down the road will be. I have one example for you from, I think I had mentioned Isaac Gillum, who had he had served in the 54th U.S. Colored Infantry. He had had a pretty healthy political career. His wife remembered, I used to dress up and go out to hear him make speeches. That was, she said, until colored folks got put out of public offices. So one thing that my sort of plotting of where people are living and where their businesses are in the earlier 1870s versus about 1890 has shown me is that it seems, and again, I don't want to make too much of this because I don't have like a smoking gun yet, but I'm noticing the beginnings of a pattern of the center of gravity of black businesses moving away from the area of the State House in the years after the Brooks Baxter War. So again, I don't have a direct line to say this conflict happened, these people no longer feel welcome down here. That would be an oversimplification. There are a lot of other things going, the city will reorganize its wards and there's different things that go on. But one thing that we do see pretty clearly is that the sort of integrated nature of the business district that I can identify in 1871 along Markham for sure. You don't find that, in later years. So not to necessarily tie that, the reason for that being the Brooks Baxter War, but certainly at large, the reason for that is the Brooks Baxter War because it's setting off, it's propelling for the institution of Jim Crow, and again, another symposium to be had here. But really the face of the city changes a bit because of this, even if we don't quite understand fully yet how that is. I have an example of one family that I can end with here, Thomas and Louisa Young. They married in 1862. And they lived, I want to skip some of this other stuff that we don't need. They lived in Little Rock's 3rd Ward in 1870. Thomas Young was a blacksmith. Louisa's brother lived with them. He was a blacksmith as well. And their place of business, their shop, was on 513 Main. But by 1880, they're moved out like so many other Black Little Rock residents. They're further out, like say the corner of 10th and Gaines, sort of further out from that sort of core of Black businesses that I think I can identify in 1871. And so that's the kind of trend that I'm watching in terms of the sort of map of what does life look like on the ground for these folks. So thank you for giving me a chance to get a little bit into what we think we can understand about Black civilians, folks who aren't picking up a gun and serving in the militia for either side. They're just purely trying to get through their day and go about life as normally as possible. And are disrupted, okay, by this. And again, for a Black business owner's operation to be disrupted in 1874, it's much harder for them to get that back, and that's very hard fought, right, because of everything that's happened before. So the stakes of the Brooks Baxter War are very high for Black Little Rock residents and Black Arkansans as a whole. Thanks.
Chaos ensued and was reported both locally and in the papers across the region. Our first reading today comes from the Arkansas Daily Gazette of April 14, 1874, an editorial squib titled, "Honesty What?" It is a remarkable fact that both of the present editors of The Republican, the other daily newspaper in town at the time, supported Mr. Brooks for governor in 1872. They are the men who object to a grand jury because one member of the Democratic State Central Committee happened to be placed on it. They are the men, or the representatives of the men, who privately assured one of the jury commissioners that they would withdraw their patronage from him because he participated and assisted in the selection of an honest grand jury. They are the men who cried wolf against Sheriff Oliver and other state and county officials in 1872 and claimed to be the exponents of all the honesty in the Republican Party. These are the men who now abuse and vilify honest men because they desire to do right.
Little Rock Republican, April 21st. Are the people of Arkansas to be driven or incited into a revolution because a new man by the name of Baxter, who was never elected, is making pretensions to an office? Is the question of the right entitled to the office of governor above and beyond the rights of the people, the arm of the law, and the peace and tranquility of the state? Must we have slaughter and bloodshed to gratify the ambition and to support the pretended claims of a confessed usurper? We think the public will pause before engaging in a wild and violent course to carry out such purposes.
Gazette, April 21, from the Memphis Avalanche. The public interests of Arkansas are safest in Governor Baxter's keeping, and while viewing it as still an open question whether he or Brooks was actually elected, one to be decided only by a closer analysis of the character of the vote that was made at the time. We trust he will be able to legally establish his right to the office he has held for 16 months.
New Orleans Picayune. The telegrams recently received from Little Rock convey intelligence of revolutionary proceedings in Arkansas of the most audacious character that have occurred in yet the long and dismal train of such incidents in the South. While of the merits of the controversy between Baxter and Brooks for the governorship, we are not fully informed, but from the employment of violence and military force by Brooks without judicial authority, and, in fact, after the refusal of the courts to recognize his claim, we infer that the whole affair is one of lawless resistance to the de jure and de facto government of the state.
The Memphis Ledger. A few days since, the Telegraph announced that Powell Clayton had left Washington and was on his way to Arkansas, and the people of that unfortunate state began to whisper to each other, "Look out, the devil is loose and coming." Villainy follows the track of Clayton naturally, as slime follows the track of the water moccasin as it glides from the green scum of the stagnant pool. And when the people of Arkansas learned that he was in their midst, they knew that some deviltry was on hand, and the coup d'etat of Joe Brooks is the result. The people of Arkansas, just as they were congratulating themselves on the prospect of peace, tranquility, freedom, enfranchisement of prosperity, are to be bedeviled with increased taxes and excited by new enmities in order that the radicals may perpetuate their hold upon the throat and pockets of the taxpayers.
Our next presenter is an educator, an artist, a songwriter, a musician, a raconteur. Charley Sandage was the creator of a musical, I'm not sure, an entertainment, an operetta, an oratorio, a musical interpretation called Helene, which premiered here several years ago, has not yet had a full mounted production, but hopes spring eternal. It is a piece of theater set against the background, the unsettled background of the Brooks Baxter War. I give you one of Arkansas's living treasures and a good songwriter to boot, Mr. Charley Sandage.
This document, I'll slip over here so we hear this while he's setting up. This document was brought to us today by Mr. and Ms. Nash, and it is from May 9th, 1874, and it's signed Governor Joseph Brooks. I've not seen anything signed Governor Joseph Brooks ever, nor has David Ware or any other. So this is just coming to us for the first time. And so before you leave, this is a rare and important document. You want to see this before they carry it back home. But I wanted to share that with you because it is pretty cool to see this with your own very eyes, right? So I'm going to send it there.
I appreciate the introduction, David. There's one point on which I'd like to correct him. He described me as the creator of the Helene and the Little War script for a musical. I was one of three, and I'll get to that in just a second. But it was here in this room in 2018 when we did a full-fledged reading, music included, and it happened that David Ware was here, and that and other things led to my being invited to join in here today, and I really appreciate it. We were Charlie Crow, a dear friend and fellow songwriter and avid reader of Arkansas history, and Dr. David Eshelman, who was then theater director and now is chair of communications and media studies at Arkansas Tech. We lost Charlie 5 years ago, but his wife, Ann, is here today, as is David Eshelman. And we are still three out there hoping one day for a chance at a full production for Helene. Now, how did this script happen? Around 1996, I started a whole other kind of songwriting than I had ever done. Story songs about people and events in Arkansas history. I'd read a bit about the Brooks Baxter War, and I thought, okay, I'll write one of my little 3 or 4 minute songs and explain the Brooks Baxter War. Gave that up. But I was still hooked in. I kept making notes. And once Charlie and I were working on songs together, a whole other kind of thing, and I told him about this little monster I had begun to poke at. And he said, okay. He started to say, you've got to pursue that. And he said, no, we've got to pursue that. So we developed some stuff, some songs, a kind of scenario, and realized that we had no earthly idea how to actually write a script for a musical. And we went on a bit of a ramble looking for help there, and were very fortunate to find David Eshelman. Our script was workshopped and revised and read and revised. Oh, I should say to you that in one of our earlier versions, actually for a couple of iterations, we had one character whom we finally had to lose. We had Ida Brooks, Joseph's daughter, as something of a narrator. That got to be unwieldy, and so unfortunately we lost Ida. I don't know if anyone has ever done a thesis or a dissertation or a major paper on Ida Brooks. If not, somebody should. We took this war going on in 1874 here in Little Rock and elsewhere, as we've seen, as honestly backdrop to our sort of through line. The idea that before the Civil War, everybody from a hill country shopkeeper to a plantation owner to a slave on that plantation knew their place. After the war and at the end of Reconstruction, nobody was quite sure of their place, quite sure of their footing. And that's what we set out to explore. We set the story mostly in a boarding house because we could put it anywhere we want. It was right about where Historic Arkansas Museum is now. And there are scenes in this building, of course, but the bulk of it takes place with people coming and going in the boarding house. I might use, I think it's sort of a passé word, stakeholders. But these were people with different opposing views about what Arkansas ought to be like when this whole thing was over. And those characters came and went in the boarding house. The proprietor, the owner, in a complicated way, is a former slave whose name is Helene. And what came and went, who came and went, and what was discussed mostly there is what we want to deal with. And there was an awareness, by the way, that a new Constitution would be written in the summer of '74. And so our play takes place from around May right down into that time when of course, the Brooks Baxter War came to an end. Or has it? I'll do a few songs, really parts of songs, no complete song, just to hear the perspective of some of these characters. Andy, this character, is a young protege of Baxter. He was newly elected to the legislature from up in the hill country. He had almost no contact with any slaves growing up, and he doesn't really understand what it is that the redeemers, the returning sort of old guard, among whom are many planters. He doesn't really understand what they want and what they believe they deserve. Baxter explains it's all in the mathematics of sharecropping and opportunities adjacent to that are offered by the existence of the poll tax. I'll talk a little bit more about the poll tax with another character. This is the arithmetic of cotton. If you lost your slaves, that's money lost. You can't make a cotton crop figure up the cost. Who'll pay attention to a flat broke man? You can't get it back without field hands. Land plus land equals bales for sale. That's the arithmetic of cotton. So your slaves now have another name. Sharecroppers, tenants, all the same. Control their votes, you got your good life back. That's easier to do if their skin is black. Count up your money, there's your power. Count up your votes, you're stronger by the hour. Ship out your bales, the money's flowing back. You just need field hands, preferably black. When you count, race everybody in their place. Now you've got the arithmetic of cotton. Now, it's worth noting in passing that New York bankers who financed the cotton economy, New England textile manufacturers and ship owners and builders, some of them staunch abolitionists, also depended heavily on what those field hands were going to produce in the cotton field. But they never had been burdened with the necessity of owning slaves. Later, Andy finds himself courting the white daughter of the man who had once owned Helene. Lots of complicated relationships in our story. But this gentleman, who was the former owner of Helene, as I pointed out, he sees plantation life differently. I've seen her smiling with dew on her face, wearing white cotton gowns and sparkling green lace. Her rivers at night are bright silver bands. She's a beautiful lady, the sweet Delta land. You just dress her pretty, you just hold her near. She'll love you and bring you new life every year. Your family and fortune will grow like a vine. This will be your son, just like it's been mine. My father's father, in some distant past, came here in search of a dream that would last. Oppression and war seemed to sweep it away, but this lady, the sweet Delta land's here today. Here lies your fortune where black earth runs deep. The old life's not dead here, it's only asleep. We can now waken her, now comes our plan to dance once again with the sweet Delta land. At one point, Andy, who's gotten acquainted with the senator, or senator character, who heads the rather small remaining black caucus. And the senator is realistic. He's pretty sure about what's coming up, particularly when the Constitutional Convention comes about. And in that convention, where there were some black members, one of the issues that they raised, the one that they pushed on the most, which I once heard very well-known Arkansans who was actually in the process of doing some writing about the Brooks Baxter War. And I mentioned that that caucus, the Black Caucus, wanted to do away with the poll tax. And this gentleman told me that that was never a big issue. Well, it was to the black members because they had already seen what manipulation of the very fact that there was something standing between a potential voter and voting. And it was the poll tax, and a lot could be done with that. Again, the senator was quite realistic. So when Andy said, no, you're going to be protected under the new Constitution, you know, essentially it's all going to be fine, it's all going to work out. I just believe that. I'm going to read rather than play the lyric in which the senator responds to that from Andy. I don't dream your dreams. Devils you don't know take hold of mine. You can't see this fire, the smoke that rises from it makes you blind. For all my life, for any cause or none, for any word or none, my life could quickly, simply end. My friend, you've seen it done. Strange as it may seem to you, I cannot dream your dreams. I don't need your dreams. Angels I've known have set mine free. You dream in black and white. I dream in colors you can't see. White to your laws and rights, black to your wrongs. My colors come in changing shades of hurts and hopes and songs. Hard as it may seem to you, I will not dream your dreams. No God of yours will save me. No plan of yours will free me. And you alone can't free yourself without me. You need me black to know that you're white. But your souls are on the block in a marketplace where money makes it right. And when it's sold, can you, my friend, be free? Your freedom's built upon the backs of people just like me. Your dreams are yours, mine still are mine. I'll never dream your dreams. After Andy takes this in, and the senator has left the conversation on stage, he begins to reflect about one young black person that he did know who happened to be owned by the mercantile store in which Andy worked when he was a young man. And he reflects and speaks to that young man he once knew. As a boy, I saw you go about your business, your master's business. That's all I saw. You disappeared at night, I didn't notice. That's how it was in life and law. I never saw your change. You never said a word, at least not what I heard about your pain. Now the lighting changes, and Dominique, the 18-year-old daughter of Helene, is seen in the kitchen. Andy has become acquainted with Helene and her daughter and all this kind of thing by now, has learned a great deal from them. And he directs this verse to her, or this little bit. I never saw the wall, the one you can't see through, to a time when you are you, as long as it remains. Then he turns and reflects to himself and to the audience. All this time I've been thinking I'm free. I was bound up in some blindness. Now I see, if any one man can be captive, that one man might be me. I never saw my chains, because I never saw your chains. It's time to hear from our central character, Elaine. Here she recalls that moment when the Union soldiers came through the plantation, and she lit out for Little Rock because she knew that Union troops under General Steele were in charge there. Don't take long to leave a cotton field, but there's a long, long road to travel before your heart is free. They'll finally steal your soul, those chains will. Made of iron or made of paper, they still hold some of me. I can own the house I live in, own the clothes I wear, but I'm not sure I own my mind yet. A whisper's always there, saying some of me will never leave that cotton field. Some of me will never quite be free. Now I won't forget the hour I left those cotton fields. Everything I ever knew I left behind that day. My little girl was brave, oh, I can't see it still. Maybe it'll be all right, was all that I could say. There was an angel on my shoulder, I know she brought me here. But that devil on the other one still whispers in my ear, saying some of me will never leave that cotton field. Some of me will never quite be free. Perhaps someday that cotton field will leave me, then at last I'll finally be free. I want to talk a minute before closing with Elaine's final song. I mentioned about relationships in our play, and I want to talk about that. I mentioned first that we, two old white guys and one not so old white guy, felt we needed someone actively looking over our shoulders. Dr. Sharice Jones Branch, most of you know her, with long-time study in women's and especially black women's experience over time in the South, agreed to take over that function for us. Among the first questions that I put to Elaine, this took place, Mark, during a little seminar that you had put together, and you had, and I called you and said, hey, I've got songs that would fit each one of these presentations. I pushed my way in, and Mark said, oh, okay, come on down and do the songs. But one of the speakers was Sharice, and I wanted to meet her. So I don't know if I ever explained to you that I manipulated that way. First question to put to her was this. I had suspicions whether Elaine might have any kind of mixed feelings about having become having a child fathered by the young master from about 18 years earlier. Of course, today's assumption would be that it was brutal rape and nothing more, nothing else could ever surround it. But her response was, of course. Elaine would have wondered what it meant to him then and now, and she would try to sort out what it meant to her then and now. Turns out that when Elaine had a chance to take over this building where she had been the maid in a brothel, and then at the point when the Army pulled out, the Union Army pulled out, there wasn't that much more business for the brothel, and the place was given into her hands if she wanted it. Problem was, it was going to take money to refurbish and get it ready and to obtain a title. And the only person on earth she knew that she might be able to get help from was the young master, now the old master, who was by then a widower, a Confederate veteran officer, and one of the Redeemer politicians. Early in the story, he shows up at a boarding house. Later, he invites her to return to the plantation as his housekeeper. Dominique, their daughter, got on the boarding house. Helene is both drawn in and repelled by this offer until some events make it clear that the man would, in fact, be little more than a predator. So, having gone through all of that, and also realizing that the kind of protective bubble she and all former slaves in Arkansas had lived in for over a decade was coming to an end, she reflects on how she sees all of this. If all your life you never tasted honey, from the first drop on your tongue, you know that you want more. When your first crumb of love falls off of someone's table, you know this is like nothing you've ever felt before. Hard to think that nothing will taste that sweet again. Hard to think no touch will take you back to where you've been. Once you've seen a candle burning in the night, you never want to be without the light. If you're finally on a journey of your choosing, and you find the road you're traveling is dark and steep and long, do you somehow think the angels will make it smooth for you? Did you somehow think if you are right, nothing can go wrong? It's hard to think the journey is never gonna end. Harder still to think your hopes are just before the wind. But once you've seen a candle burning in the night, you never want to be without the light. I'm done for questions or whatever follows.
Return with us now to Washington, D.C., to the deliberations of the House Committee on Affairs in Arkansas. Testimony of a Mr. Corcoran of Pine Bluff, questioned by Representative Poland.
I want to ask a word about this constitutional convention. You understand that the legislature has called a constitutional convention?
Yes.
Is the convention to amend the Constitution or to form a new Constitution?
To form a new Constitution, as I understand it.
What do you understand to be the difficulties with the existing Constitution?
I do not know exactly.
Is there a general movement against it?
I have heard lawyers say that certain provisions of the Constitution were very crude, and several have been very rejected. And it was thought that it would be very beneficial to the state to have a new one.
I'm talking of a sentiment of dissatisfaction with the Constitution among the people at large.
I have heard a great many experts, I've heard great many express dissatisfaction with it.
Of what particulars?
I cannot tell any particular points.
You're not aware of any particular provision of the Constitution to which there is a general sentiment of dissatisfaction among the people?
There is an opinion that it ought to be checked. The people are very well satisfied with the college convention.
Do you think that this movement to change the Constitution is for the purpose of getting rid of some of the defects in the Constitution, or is it for the purpose of changing the government?
My understanding of the Constitution Convention is that it is to frame a new Constitution and to submit it to the people, and that the general officers of the state are to be elected at the same time with the adoption of the Constitution.
it will really be an entire change that the administration threw out?
Yes, people desire.
It has been called a convention for the purpose of forming a new constitution.
That is the way I understand it. I may be wrong, however, in regard to it.
And some further words to the Poland Committee from former General Robert Howard on Arkansas, under questioning by Baxter's attorney, the Honorable and Ponderous Albert Pike.
You have been in Arkansas long enough to know something about the people of the state.
Yes, sir, I've been nearly there 10 years.
You know something of the general character of the people there.
Yes, sir, I do.
Arkansas has had a bad reputation abroad. Are not the people as law-abiding a class of people as anywhere?
I think they are as quiet as any people I've met in my life.
Is there any disposition to perpetuate acts of violence upon anybody?
I think not.
Will not this constitution affect Governor Baxter as much as anyone else should there be a change of government?
He will go out of office.
Is not this convention looked upon by the people as a peaceful solution to the whole difficulty?
Yes, sir, that is the ardent desire on the part of the people to have this matter decided by the convention.
In the end, the Brooks Baxter War was settled not by bullets and martial ardor on the plains and streams of battle, but rather by lawyers' salvos echoing through the chambers of Washington, D.C. Not on the plains of Arkansas, not at Palarm, but in the deep heart of Foggy Bottom was the war finally brought to an end, with a bit of very careful fence straddling and jurisprudential, could I say babble, on the part of the eminent Attorney General of the United States.
Department of Justice, Washington, May 15, 1874. Mr. President, sir, Elisha Baxter claiming to be governor of Arkansas and Joseph Brooks also claiming to be governor of that state, each having made application, etc. Section 4, Article 4 of the Constitution of the United States is as follows. The United States shall guarantee to every state of the Union a republican form of government, and shall protect each of them against invasion, and on application of the legislature of the executive, when the legislature cannot be convened, against domestic violence. When in pursuant of this provision of the Constitution, two persons, each claiming to governor, make calls respectively upon their president under said clause of the Constitution, it is of course becomes necessary for him to determine which of the said persons is the constitutional governor of the state. As between Baxter and Brooks, according to the Constitution and laws of the state, the votes for governor were counted and Baxter declared elected. Once duly inaugurated as governor of the state, there's a great difficulty in holding that he who usurped the office unto which he was inducted under these circumstances. Take the provisions of the Constitution and the two decisions of the Supreme Court, and the conclusion irresistibly follows that the judgment of the Circuit Court is void. A void judgment hurts no one.
To which responded President Grant in these words: to J.G. Frierson, Senate President Pro Tem, and James H. Berry, House Speaker Pro Tem, Little Rock. By the President of the United States of America, a proclamation. Whereas certain turbulent and disorderly persons pretending that Elisha Baxter, the President Executive of Arkansas, was not elected, have combined together with force and arms to resist his authority, as such executive and other authorities have said, state. And whereas it is provided in the laws of the United States that in all cases of insurrection in any state, or of the obstruction to the laws thereof, it shall be lawful for the President of the United States to employ such part of the land and naval forces as shall be judged necessary for the purpose of suppressing such insurrection or causing the laws to be duly executed. Now therefore I, Ulysses S. Grant, President of the United States, do hereby make proclamation and command all turbulent and disorderly persons to disperse and return peaceably to their respective abodes within 10 days from this date, and hereafter to submit themselves to the lawful authority of said executive and the other constituted authorities of the state. And I invoke the aid and cooperation of all good citizens to uphold the law and preserve public peace, done at the city of Washington this 15th day of May in the year of our Lord 1874, and of the independence of the United States the 98th. Ulysses S. Grant. On May 16th, J.W. Fuller of Washington, D.C., wrote to Governor Elisha Baxter concerning the resolution of the Brooks Baxter War.
Dear Governor, allow me to congratulate you of the people of Arkansas and the success of right over wrong, honesty, truth, and justice over the most damned set of villains that ever cursed any state. Keep straight forward as you have done heretofore, and press the villains to the wall. Impeach the dishonest scoundrel judges. Purify the courts. Platonism having received its death blow, peace and prosperity will accrue in the state. I did what I could for your cause at every breath from the first period. I talked 1 whole hour with Attorney General Williams the day before the decision on the situation in Arkansas, and told him in emphatic language the whys and wherefores of the Brooks movement. I talked it to everyone I met, and flattered myself I did some little good in furnishing the authorities here the light by which to understand the animus of the whole affair. I am sorry to say, and I guess they are sorry too now, that out of all the Arkansas men here, Judge Wilshire, Bartlett, and myself were the only persons here that took sides with you from the start. But now we hope for recruits. Would they thank God for your success? I am, dear Governor, yours faithfully, J.W. Fuller.
That summer, a constitution was drafted, Arkansas's 5th. It was adopted in the fall of 1874, and it is with us still, visible under 100 or so amendments after all this time. The respective militias were sent home. The restored Governor Baxter took good advice eventually and agreed to not persecute or prosecute his erstwhile foes. Arkansas's government, with the adoption of the new Constitution, got a hard reset. Our new governor would be Augustus Garland of Hempstead County. Baxter and the other elected constitutional officers and statewide officials left office, including one, Joseph Carter Corbin, the superintendent of public instruction, the first and to date only African American elected to statewide executive office in Arkansas. Garland himself would later become U.S. Senator from Arkansas and ultimately Attorney General of the United States, assuming the mantle of Mr. Williams. Elisha Baxter left office, returned to Batesville, and practiced law for most of the rest of his life. He died on May 31st, 1899, after a month's illness, and is buried in Batesville's Oak Lawn Cemetery. One of his children explained after his death that Baxter, quote, always tried to avoid trouble. Nice one. Joseph Brooks received the appointment as postmaster of Little Rock from President Grant the same month he ceased his election contest. Brooks made peace with his opponents in his own party, participated in the Republican Party state convention in 1876. Rumors suggest that he hoped that he would be the party's nominee for governor that year, but he was not chosen. Brooks died in Little Rock on April 30th, 1877. King Cannon White, the mighty Hercules, went on to serve several terms as mayor of Pine Bluff, and he also spent time in the Arkansas Senate. The African American militia of both sides returned to their homes and lives. Their rights and protections as citizens would be eroded as the era of Jim Crow settled in Arkansas and across the rest of the old Confederacy by the century's end. As far as that piece of artillery, salvaged by Baxter's forces to use in threatening Brooks's men barricaded at the State House, soon after the end of the conflict, it was placed on the State House grounds. Dubbed Lady Baxter and never fired in anger, it remains there today, our state's first and best loved selfie station. In October 1908, 10-year-old John Isaac Wilde was skylarking on the barrel of the old gun along with some of his friends. He took a tumble and broke his arm. The Arkansas Gazette made note of this, quipping that Master Wilde was Lady Baxter's first casualty. As for the records of the Brooks Baxter War, many of them were basically bundled up and stuck in the cellar of the old Capitol, today's old State House, some few feet below where we sit today. Many of them were scheduled to be thrown out in the 1890s, cleared out of the basement to be sold as scrap paper to be pulped up in St. Louis. An enterprising postal clerk named Lewis Gully got the contract to clean out the basement, and he high-graded the stuff as it was being tossed into the rail car parked behind the State House, saving the most important-looking documents as he pitched the paper. One of the documents he saved is a fitting coda to the official history of the Brooks Baxter War, because, of course, at the end of any conflict or dispute, there's the lawyer's bill to be submitted.
Office of Pike and Johnson, Counselors, Solicitors, and Agents for Claims, Washington, D.C., September 18, 1874. His Excellency, E. Baxter, Dear Sir, the enclosed account of W.H. Moore is correct, and would have been presented earlier, but that your embarrassment for want of friends was known. Please reply. In regard to our fee for services to the state during the recent great controversy, we left it to yourself to determine the amount by your own estimate of its value. Your judgment, we take it, will be satisfactory to the people of Arkansas as to us. Very respectfully, Pike and Johnson, attorneys.
John P. Harrell, the first real chronicler of the Brooks Baxter War, concluded his 1893 book on the conflict with a comment that can be taken as slightly pompous, charitable, or slightly tongue-in-cheek, or maybe all of the above. He wrote, "There were great abilities exerted and splendid work done by the leaders of the opposing factions of the Republican Party in that conflict. Their division among themselves produced the usual result of such quarrels, which are the subject of illustrations throughout time in song and fable by Aesop, La Fontaine, Boileau, and Alexander Pope." Harrell concluded by adding in a few lines from that great English wit and translator Alexander Pope. Pope wrote, "Once, says an author, where I need not say, 2 travelers found an oyster in their way. Both fierce, both hungry, the dispute grew strong, when, scale in hand, Dame Justice came along. Before her, each with clamor pleads the laws, explains the matter, and would win the cause. Dame Justice, weighing long the doubtful right, takes, opens, and swallows the oyster before their sight. The cause of strife removed so rarely well, there, take, says Justice, take thee each a shell. We thrive at Westminster on such fools as you. It was a fat oyster. Go, live in peace. Now adieu." Thus concludes the regular proceedings, ladies and gentlemen. We have a brief time for a question and answer period, if you would like. I invite questions, comments. We have eminent presenters. We have hapless readers. We are here for your pleasure. Sir.
How did this Arkansas war compare to the other southern states? Arkansas? How did this war in Arkansas compare to the other southern states during Reconstruction?
Not as bloody as Louisiana. I have to tell you, I think, or someone. I just got finished reading a biography of James Longstreet's post-war career, and it was a very bloody battle. Of course, Longstreet joined the Republican Party, which did not do much to help his reputation with his former comrades in arms or with Democrats. And there was very bloody fighting in New Orleans that was largely racial in nature. And Grant had been forced to intervene there in 1872 and had been castigated by the press. And I think that's why he was reluctant to get involved in the Brooks Baxter War, because he'd been so criticized. I want to know one other thing, David. Despite the serious nature of this, Ken Barnes has pointed out that it was in Little Rock at the time of Brooks Baxter a very festive atmosphere. that vendors were on the streets selling their wares, you know. If it had been today, there would have been T-shirts saying, "I survived the Brooks Baxter War." And he reported that the police did arrest one woman who was wearing man's clothes and was inebriated and declaring loudly that she wanted to join the Army.
Again, two questions. First of all, is there a website or a printed source that would have a compilation of the illustrations with the Brooks Baxter War, including the Leslie's political cartoon and other cartoons, the Brooks Baxter War at the time? That's my first question. And the second, among scholars of the Civil War, scholars of Arkansas history, if you had to come down to a consensus, not including the coming of the current state constitution, but if you had to have a consensus on what would be maybe the most important short-term and the most important long-term result or consequence of the Brooks Baxter War, what would you say that would be?
Who wants that? Okay.
So there's an Encyclopedia of Arkansas entries on pretty much every aspect of the Brooks Baxter War, and you'll find the illustrations there.
Yeah, I'd say that, of course, the immediate consequence was the end of Reconstruction. And the 1874 Constitution basically undid as much of the 1868 Constitution as possible, and made more officers elective rather than appointed, because Powell Clayton had used the appointment power greatly. And the new Constitution, one which we still have, reduced the governor's term of office. It was a strike against strong executive power, weakened the power of the governor, cut his salary. And I think all that was a reaction to Powell Clayton. And of course, it was so well crafted, it's been amended 100 times or something like that.
So just a quick comment as to sources on the Brooks Baxter War. My name is Darren Bell. I'm with the State Archives on my day off. I work with preserving newspapers, and a part of the staff that's working on the National Newspaper Digitization Project, also known as Chronicling America. At the urging of my esteemed superior here, we made the decision to add issues of the Arkansas Republican, the Morning Republican, in this cycle, so they will be available freely online at the Library of Congress website within the next probably year, so you can read about this. Now, delving into newspapers and the Brooks Baxter War, I do have a question. You know, how was this reported in other parts of the state? Did they take the Gazette's word for it? I'm especially interested in the political parties. You know, if you're trying to label political parties, it's hard and it's murky. But how would folks up in the Ozarks see the Brooks Baxter War particularly? Because that was a hotbed of union activity or union support.
All right, that's a good question. That's a Kelly Jones question, I think. The Ozarks, you have how many real solid questions in there? Everybody got that? There's 2 questions in that. First one, the syndicate thing, right? The newspaper syndicates in the tell them about that, right? You got it.
Well, newspapers in the 19th century, they lived on exchanges, essentially clippings or stories sent over the wire. You know, there's a reason, for instance, that the folks in Washington can read the New York paper on April 16th with a report of what's going down in Little Rock, because the Herald's reporter telegraphed a story there. But also you had exchanges through the post offices. Stories would be disseminated throughout the state. They might be rewritten. They might simply be reprinted as the clipping showed. But there's a network of exchanges of newspapers regionally and in the state, and that's how the news got disseminated. You know, before AP and Reuters and United Press International, you had postmasters. and you had clippings. Old technology, but it worked back then. And by the way, one other potential thing to look at in terms of illustrations from the Brooks Baxter War, we are currently preparing, the gentleman who's sitting back at the table there, Brian Irby, is putting together a Google exhibit. It'll be an online exhibit of materials related to the Brooks Baxter War. We don't have it up quite yet, but we're working on it. Also, we have a number of documents related to the Brooks Baxter War, including Councilor Pike's gentle bill. We have those available on our digital collections platform.
That one brings us to the point that I forgot in my intro is pretty much the eyes of the nation were looking to Little Rock for 1 month. They were watching to see what's our next move, because if things would have went south here, who knows what bricks fall after that. That was the thing. So I meant to say that. More questions, guys. We're doing good. I mean, we've got a lot of information. Stephen Cook has a question, everyone.
My question may seem a little frivolous from all this, but I'm wondering about the significance of the Anthony House. Could anyone speak to that?
Why they chose that, basically, right? Like why they held up there. I mean,
because it was the most obvious place to go. It was the best hotel in Little Rock.
It was, David, I'll add to that. It was also at that time, I believe, the stagecoach office and the telegraph office.
Yes.
Yeah. So it was the communication center for town.
I forgot that. Yeah, so the telegraphs between Little Rock and Pine Bluff are fast and furious, back and forth, because their headquarters is at the telegraph office, which means that Brooks guys got to go find somewhere else to send the telegraph as well. That's strategic location. Good job, Ian. I forgot that part. All right, next question. You guys are doing great. Yes, sir.
I don't remember, of course, it's been years since I've been to school, but I don't remember much about this, but I remember it being touched on, but I was just curious as if I just missed it or if it wasn't touched on, since it was such a spotlight on Arkansas, how come or why we don't they teach it more to our students and stuff.
Good question. You want to talk about why we don't focus on Reconstruction? This is my 20-year education. That's 20 years teaching history at Denver High School. A lot of them spend homesteading that are agreed upon by the social studies people at the public education. So, yes, I would love for Brooks Baxter War to talk to the students of Arkansas. Unfortunately, it's just not one of those things.
Do we have any records of federal troops or federal troops were here?
Records of the federal troops, the U.S. troops here. Yeah, there are.
I don't know that we have them at the state archives. There certainly should be some records of federal troops. Yeah.
Yeah, there should be. There should. I don't know where they are, but there should be a record of the correspondence between Garrison. Yeah. They keep things.
Yes.
That might be a Stephen McIntyre question.
Dr. Jones.
Okay, so I can speak to the college level coverage. The students don't think that they like hearing about Reconstruction, so they kind of zone out. They think that political history is difficult. I guess it is. When you start saying, okay, well, this one guy, he was doing a pretty good job of courting the former Confederates, and he's like, hey, well, we're going to remove these disabilities, okay, is the term they used on their voting and office holding. But then this other guy starts outdoing him on that, so now he's got this support, and now, we're going to do this, and it's a lot. They're like, you're talking about the same party. This is within the same party, right? All of this is going on. And so they really it's hard. They think they don't like it. They think they don't like political history. But when I teach the Civil War and Reconstruction class at Arkansas Tech, the big questions that they always have are actually not about the war, they're about Reconstruction. The mind-blowing moments that they have where they're like, oh wait, that's why things are the way they are, or that's the roots of this or that. it's Reconstruction that's actually opening, their understanding more than the war years, much to my dismay, because I'm interested in the more, the earlier stuff. But, so anyway, maybe we could just do a better job of helping them understand, like, you really do have questions about this, even if you don't realize that this era here has got the answers to so much of what confuses you about the world that we live in.
You got to remember that a lot of people in Arkansas were embarrassed by the things that were leaving our state. The news getting to the rest of the world was that we were out here acting crazy again. Okay? That's basically, they're like, look at these guys down there. They can't control their government. They don't know who's in charge. They got guns all over the street. I could sell it as a crazy, chaotic scene, right? So Stephen Cook asked me last night if we were still on for this today, and I read him something. I said, what was it, Stephen? He told me, I don't know. I said, yeah, if you want to come basically see this, here it is. If you get a burning desire to share in the nerdicity of a 4-hour, 150-year commemoration of when the eyes of the world were looking at our people acting crazy, then yes, indeed, come on down. So that was my invitation. Ask me more questions.
Any more questions? Ma'am?
Texas had a very similar episode just months before. There was a disputed election, a Democratic governor on one floor of the Capitol, a Republican governor on another floor of the Capitol, and Grant came down on the side of the Democrat.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we have imposed upon you time. You allowed us 4 hours. We were at 4 hours and 5 minutes. However, there is one thing we'd like to do before we give our 4 presenters a rousing round of applause for what they have done. Presenters, would you please come forward?
You go get your stuff. Okay. This is going to be quick, but it's really cool. David has gone out of his way to commission something very special for these presenters. These guys have been doing research on this topic for decades now. You can Google this and find YouTube videos of almost every one of us talking about the Brooks Baxter War from times past. And it's very complicated then. David, here he comes. You got a table here for presentation, sir, if you need to set some stuff down, or you can. That's right.
As far as we can tell, most of Arkansans know about the Brooks Baxter War is that there was some big cannon involved in it. And when they took their 5th grade field trip to Little Rock, in addition to doing the 55 minutes, including the bathroom break tour of the state capitol, they would come down here and they would pose in front of that cannon. I hope that we have suggested there's a bit more to the story than that. However, sometimes stories just have to be reduced to their simple bits. And so, as a small token of thanks for our 4 presenters, we would like to present them with something with which to beguile those who will ask them in the future about this conflict. So, well, I'm going to ask.
Pass them out. There we go.
Charley? What is it? Let's see it. Mark.
Everyone should have a cannon of their own. Ask any 10-year-old boy. However, as with the original, which was cast in 1861 by a foundry in New Orleans, part of a group of cannon, about a third of which blew up while they were being proofed, I would not suggest that this actually be loaded and fired. Lady Baxter, like these small replicas, best enjoyed as a static object, a reminder of time past, and hopefully an occasion that's been pleasant for all present today. Thank you all. Thank you.